3 weeks in, believe it or not. Okay, it was Wednesday. We again talked a little bit about jobs. We talked about dealer built here in town. We've talked about First Citizens and Winnebago and so forth. People looking for IT positions, both IT and software. So it's exciting time, so to speak. Introduction to networks. We went through some of those basics, reviewed some key points, then we took a paper evaluation of those first two modules. We talked a little bit about protocols and reiterated a couple key things on the models, and mixed in to all this for the students working on the network, and we'll talk about that here coming up. We reviewed a little bit. Remember the shell, the command line interface, communicates with the kernel communicates with the hardware. We took a look at RAM, memory, read-only memory for when it boots. Startup config is in NVRAM, and the iOS, the Internet Working Operating System, is in Flash. So that gets loaded when you boot in the RAM. ROM gets it started when it boots, and then it loads next the startup config. And then we communicate through the kernel to the device with through a shell with the commands we want to perform. And you type a command in at the shell, it's immediately added to the running config in RAM. So in RAM we call it running config, in NVRAM we call it startup config. And let me highlight, as you're working here, before you, it doesn't save automatically, so you need to save a copy back to here if you want to save it. Let's move on. So the students be able to do these things. You should be able to set up a PC to communicate with a network. You know, given the right information, you set up the IP, the subnet mask, the default gateway, and your DNS services that we would be using. So I didn't draw all the switches here, but this is the scenario we have in class. The students would put a PC on. They configure the switch so we can do total management with it. Secure it in terms of access, log in to the VTY line and the console and so forth. So we have these N devices connecting in, and the students were to finish configuring their switches and apply a PC to the network. And then test it. They were going to ping. First they tested pinging from, or telnetting from switch to switch. Then eventually they were to test from their PCs. And then we did some Wireshark work with that. Looking at the network, we have, for example, this is the connection between here and the router. The router connects up to the DMZ switch, which connects to the firewall, which gets us out to the internet. To access our devices, this is that access router, right, with them, with some 32 connections coming off. And we can access that from the work server 2 using this address. Now if we're on a PC internally, we can use this address and access it too. This, I talked about in class, this is not good security, so there are access lists inside this router that stops any traffic from this direction trying to go up into our regular network. One way we could fix this is to take this link out and then just force everybody to go to the work server and then access the equipment. And we could do that. Okay. Some more terms. We're talking about protocols, and you know, they get so complex, but we don't want to get a complex too early in the course. So they really just want you to understand they handle flow control. A protocol would have response timeout if something doesn't connect or you leave something, it's going to time out. And then they talk about all the ways to access methods of accessing in. Okay, we can send unicast messages. That'd be like a client communicating with a server, client-server environment, typically a unicast. Multicast, it goes out and then goes to just some of the locations, not everywhere. And then a broadcast goes to everywhere. And we looked at some examples of those. And we'll keep using those terms during the year. Then we talked about different types of protocols. For example, HTTP, and we could add to that HTTPS. So we're working with a browser, we're going to send communications, a URL. We get the data ready, so I'm going to put the data in green. And then when we get to the transport layer, we can take that data and split it into segments. Take the data, split it into segments, we put a port number on it, and at that point we call it a segment. It's a protocol data unit, and a more detailed name would be a segment. And it could have a port number and so forth in there. So we call that encapsulation. We move that down, and here we have inside there the data, port numbers and stuff. And then we enclose it, encapsulate it again, and we put IP in there, which then determines the path, the best path that it can go. Here we call it a packet. And then you move the whole thing down again and encapsulate it again. If it's Ethernet, then we'd have MAC addresses, and now we have a frame. And then the bits are put on the media, fiber, wire, in the air. When it gets to the other end, it goes up the other way, and it gets the different parts that were encapsulated are taken off until all of a sudden the data is back up here, the URL. And then the web server responds, and it reverses it. It comes down, it goes over back to your computer, unicast. We're going to review this on Monday, and then at the end of class on Monday we have a modules 1 through 3 exam. Instead of doing the individual labs, we had one big lab. So created a document. It didn't have to be perfect this time, but you have all that introduction information, who you are, what the assignment is, and so forth. List your configurations. Proof of connectivity, show that you can ping and connect or turn that into other devices. And then they were supposed to run Wireshark, filter for ICMP, and do some pings. And they could ping here and ping their neighbor, you know, another device, and so forth, and then look at the information in Wireshark. We're going to start out Monday taking a look at that. That, along with what we talked about earlier, the OSI and TCP IP models. So, this is where we want you to submit it. So I lumped some, like 3 labs into there. And then we will cover some of the specifics from the labs on Monday. So, you should be looking at, okay, so we should be looking at the materials, module 4, I believe, the physical layer. So we're going to be talking about fiber, wireless, in the air, and wired. So you want to start working on that, and you want to wait, but you really want to make sure you're good. You should finish up modules 1 through 3, because that's where we'll have a test on also. Okay? And then let me know if you run into questions. You can, if you want to go in and remote into your switch, do a little work on it, take a look at it, maybe get some notes out of there, feel free to do that. And that's it. 3 weeks in. Doing well. All right.